with the end of the Battle of Breeds and Bunker Hill, the Americans started doing a little bit of math. The British lost 1,000 of their soldiers. The Americans only lost 400. Not only that, but even though the British had won the battle, they did not use their foothold on Charlestown to push out away from Boston. They stayed in Boston. So by the time we meet this very, very important, famous fellow named George Washington, who we've actually met before, one of the first things that he says is, wow, I wish I could sell the British another hill at that price. In other words, if they're willing to lose 1,000 of their soldiers just for one little hill, I can probably be fairly successful in this war. Now, your next notes look like this, and they will need to go on page 18, at least to start with. Now, one thing you will notice, sometimes the computer argues with me, even though it shows up on the computer the way I want it. Sometimes some of you are going to have to change the letters. In this case, the C gets changed to an A. Ooh, wouldn't that be nice, right? The D gets changed to a B. Today, we're only going to talk about the very first section here. So you don't even need to worry about the bottom part. We're only going to talk about this. So the first important thing that you need to know that happens is after the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia, and they are a group of 3 people from each of the 13 colonies who had been sent to Philadelphia to make sure that things were organized. They realized at this point that the 13 colonies were rebelling against the nation that had made all the laws and kept everything organized for them. And so first thing they did is the colonists used all of the practice they had with the Mayflower Compact and the Virginia House of Burgesses and the Massachusetts Assembly. They used all that practice to make a Continental Congress, and the Continental Congress kept the army running. And so the Continental Congress adopted this ragtag group of people that had turned into an army around Boston, and they sent George Washington as the person in charge for the army. Remember, the last time we met George Washington was during the French and Indian War. He had actually started the French and Indian War. He was warned by his scouts that the French and their Indian allies had a trap. And so instead of just marching into the trap, George Washington surrounded the people trying to trap him and beat them in the very, very first battle of the French and Indian War. George Washington had fought in other parts of the French and Indian War, but now we are a good 12 years later than that. Washington has spent most of the time in between as a farmer. He got married to his wife Martha in the meantime as well. And he had been elected to the Continental Congress. And the Congress recognized 2 reasons why they chose Washington to lead the army. One reason they chose Washington to lead the army was because of his military experience in the French and Indian War. He had been a leader. Another reason that they chose Washington, though, was because of his character. And one thing you'll notice as we go through this is George Washington was an amazing human being. For instance, when he was put up to be voted on in the Continental Congress as the head of the army, he ran out of the room. He was so humble, he did not even want to appear to be trying to get this job for himself. He also, in his speech when he accepted being in charge of the Patriot Army at Boston, he said, I have a feeling this is going to absolutely ruin me. I want you to remember that I will do my best, and I will not let you pay me. So George Washington refused to take money. He didn't know how many years it would take. He realized if he was captured, he would immediately be put to death as the leader of the rebellion. And yet he refused to be paid for this. So George Washington takes over the Patriot Army at Boston. When he gets there, he realizes there are some pretty big challenges ahead of him. One of the biggest was the fact that there were few weapons and supplies. In fact, there were so few weapons and supplies. People in the Continental Congress thought, okay, he's this great military leader from the French and Indian War. He's going to go up, gonna get all our guys together following his orders, and they're going to attack the British in Boston and kick them out. In fact, when Washington didn't do that right away, they immediately, some of them, little small groups of them, started nitpicking at him. Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? People in the newspaper started saying he was a do-nothing general. What they didn't realize is the sentries, the guards around Boston had to carry weapons without ammunition while they were within sight of British soldiers in Boston. There were only 2 barrels of gunpowder when Washington took over. So he's there camped out in charge of an army outside Boston, but he can't attack it, even though he's supposed to keep the British army blockaded inside Boston. Well, there's a fellow, he's about 20 years old. He used to own a bookstore, and he weighs 250 pounds. Yep, look it up. Henry Knox weighed approximately 250 pounds, but he was a fellow who, as part of owning his bookstore, he read his own books, and he got a lot of books that were about artillery. That would be cannons, and the strategies of using cannons and moving them around. Henry Knox gets to looking at a map, and he says, well, up there in New York, only a couple of 100 miles away. I have to zoom in a good bit. So Boston is right here. Fort Ticonderoga in New York is way over here. And what geographic feature is between Boston and northern New York? Oh yeah, that would be the Appalachian Mountains. But Henry Knox, this 20-year-old bookseller, comes to George Washington and says, I have this idea. If you give me permission, I will take a group of men to Fort Ticonderoga in New York. We will get the cannons that are there, and we will bring them back. And, oh yeah, by the way, it's the middle of winter. How did that go? Well, first of all, you got to look sideways. Sorry. This is a hill, a mountain basically, above Fort Ticonderoga. So Fort Ticonderoga is right down there. This is Lake Champlain. In the winter, it's frozen, which makes it a bit easier to maneuver on. So what had happened was Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, at about the same time as Lexington and Concord, they had snuck up on Fort Ticonderoga. So this was the summer before Henry Knox is coming to Fort Ticonderoga. So the summer before, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had snuck up on Fort Ticonderoga. They had come up this hill. You can see they had to sneak up because look at all these cannons pointing out. It was held by the British, but not very many of them. And there was a guy standing guard. But what happened was he was standing guard at this little door. Yes, I know you have to look sideways again. Sorry. He's standing guard at this little door. And Ethan Allen, Benedict Arnold, and their men snuck up such that the guard when he ran into the fort, he didn't get that little door shut. That's called a wicket door. So the wicket door was left open. It didn't take Ethan Allen, Benedict Arnold, and their men very long to get through that wicket door and into the courtyard of Fort Ticonderoga. And they went up these steps to where the British commander had been sleeping. And they woke him up. And this is what one artist thinks it would have been like. The commander comes out. They're like, "Surrender in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress." So, the British commander surrenders. And these are all items that were there. This is the sword of the commander. We have some weapons. This is the key to the fort. That had happened back in the summer, and now Henry Knox gets there in the winter of 1775, and these cannons, he now takes them apart. And this cannon, by the way, this is one of the cannons that Henry Knox took from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. You'll notice it looks like there's a film crew here, and that's exactly what was happening. There's a PBS show. I've never managed to catch this yet, but apparently there's this guy that goes around the United States to historic places. He visits them on his motorcycle. And so that PBS show was there filming when I was at Fort Ticonderoga, and they wanted to make sure that they got this cannon that Henry Knox had taken from Fort Ticonderoga down to Boston. What did he have to get through? The Appalachian Mountains. So those cannons had to be hauled up and over and back down the Appalachian Mountains in the middle of winter. I know this is kind of a blurry one, but that's me next to a specific type of cannon. This is called a mortar because you see how huge the openings are. But again, just to give you an idea of how big these cannons are, right? This is a bit of a video.
January 1st, 1776. It's a new year for a new army, and General Washington raises a new flag to commemorate it, the Grand Union, with 13 stripes representing both the differences and common cause of the 13 colonies, and with the British Union Jack in the upper left to acknowledge those colonial leaders hoping to salvage a relationship with England. That same day, the colonies get the news of the King's October Proclamation to crush the rebellion by any means necessary. It's a stunning declaration by the King that rouses rebel ire more than ever. But an army needs more than anger to fight a war. With the onset of winter, neither side has the supplies necessary to brave the cold and snow. The British hole up in Boston, waiting for reinforcements and supplies from England, while Washington uses the time to piece together an army short on everything from manpower to gunpowder. But help is on the way. Henry Knox, a 25-year-old colonel and former Boston bookseller, is leading a trek from Cambridge to Fort Ticonderoga on a quest for arms.
So again, one reason why these videos are helpful is they give you a really good visualization of what it looked like.
Knox has taken it upon himself to recover the artillery captured from the British at Fort Ticonderoga. For 2 months, in the cold and wet, he, his men, and teams of oxen haul 120,000 pounds of artillery across 300 miles of muddy woods, frozen rivers, and steep, icy slopes back to headquarters in Cambridge.
So 300 miles. Now you'll notice they followed a river for a lot of that time. This is part of the reason this worked during the winter. With the river frozen, it was much easier to travel along the Hudson River, but they couldn't go the whole way. There is a historical fiction book written for kids about this called Guns for General Washington. I highly recommend it. It's a really good read.
On January 25th, Colonel Knox delivers all of the weaponry to his commander-in-chief, miraculously intact. It is the best gift Washington could ever receive. Finally, he has the firepower he so badly needs. Washington also has in Knox a valued new commander in charge of artillery.
Henry Knox is going to come up again in several different battles. It says he's the commander of artillery. Remember, that just means cannons.
Knox becomes part of Washington's inner circle of junior officers, whose counsel he values enormously.
Now, just in case that video doesn't play, I will put it as a separate link. You'll have to go watch it separately. Sometimes it tells me that they will or won't play, but it only tells me that after I load them up. So just be aware, if you just watched a blank screen while it seemed like I was just talking about nothing, just be aware that it will be in the next link that you'll be able to watch it. You should have all of this information, oops, there we go, filled in. We will talk about what happened when the British went to New York City tomorrow. So don't lose this sheet of paper, but that's all you need for today.